Echo 7.
17 days. A few yards. One engineer doing a routine inspection of a fire stairwell almost no one ever opened. That is the distance, in time and in space, between the moment a 57-year-old woman with a wristband on her arm walked away from her hospital bed and the moment her body was found by accident inside the same building. She had a chart. She had a bed number. She had a nurse assigned to check on her every 15 minutes. She had cameras in the hallway and a sheriff's deputy stationed inside the building. The hospital was a level 1 trauma center with a campus covering 24 acres, a security budget in the millions, and a stated patient safety protocol that ran to over 400 pages. She had never left the hospital. The hospital had simply stopped seeing her. Her name was Lynn Spaulding. She is one of 12 people examined here, across 3 continents and more than a decade. The pattern in all 12 cases is the same. One woman froze to death on the roof of the hospital she had come to for help, dressed only in a thin gown, while staff downstairs assumed she was still in her bed. One Army veteran who had just had hip surgery was found dead in a stairwell 60 feet from his apartment. After 30 days of his disappearance, being treated asn't the responsibility of anyone in particular. One mother spent a full year searching for her daughter, posting flyers, calling police, hiring private investigators, and the entire time her daughter's body lay in a cold storage facility belonging to the very hospital she had been admitted to. One man broke a window on the 2nd floor of a psychiatric evaluation unit, jumped onto the bushes below, and was found 5 months later floating in a lake less than 2 miles from the building. In a hospital in another country, a body was found inside the ceiling. In a hospital in the Bronx, a man went to the emergency room for a cut finger and was found 5 days later, dead, in a 3rd-floor bathroom of the same building where he had worked for years. This is not a collection of accidents. This is a pattern. You are watching Echo 7, where the disappearances are documented, the records are pulled, and the institutions are named. The investigation files referenced here were assembled from public coroner reports, civil lawsuits filed in superior courts, federal inspector general findings, district attorney summaries, and contemporaneous news reporting from the cities where these events occurred. Where surviving family members are still pursuing wrongful death litigation, only information already entered into the public record is repeated here. No detail is invented. Every hospital is named. Every date is real. The case file numbers exist and can be requested by any member of the public who is willing to fill out the forms. The cases gathered here span more than a decade, 3 continents, and 7 different categories of institution. American public hospitals, American private hospitals, a Veterans Affairs facility, behavioral health residential care, a South African provincial hospital, an Australian Catholic teaching hospital, and a British National Health Service Trust. The patients ranged in age from 28 to 75. Some had dementia. Some had type 1 diabetes. Some had nothing more complicated than an infection or a panic attack. What connects them is not what was wrong with their bodies on the day they arrived. What connects them is the moment the institution that admitted them stopped registering them as present. To understand that moment, we have to walk through 5 different kinds of wall, 5 different categories of barrier that the hospital believed it had built around the patient. And in every single one of these cases, the wall turned out to be a drawing on a page. The first wall is the wall of the room, the bed, the door, the call button, the nurse station 15 feet down the hall. This is the wall that the public believes is solid. Most people who have never worked in a hospital assume that if you are admitted, somebody knows where you are at all times. The cases in this first section show that assumption is wrong. The failure mode is not random, it repeats. Lynn Spaulding was 57 years old. She was British by birth. She had 2 adult children. On September 19th of 2013, her boyfriend Mark Casey and her daughter took her to San Francisco General Hospital. She had been complaining of stomach pain for weeks. She had lost weight. She was confused. The hospital admitted her with a bladder infection complicated by dehydration. Her electrolyte levels were elevated. She was on medication that produced further confusion. The nursing notes from the previous shift indicated that she should be checked on every 15 minutes. On the morning of September 21st of 2013, the 15-minute check order had not been properly transcribed into the bedside system overnight. She was alone in her room for at least 40 minutes before anyone noticed she was gone. A hospital employee called the sheriff's department at around 10:30 in the morning and reported that a patient was missing. In that initial report, the caller described Lynn as African American. She was not. She was a white woman of British origin, a former resident of London who had built a life in California. The error was recorded in the sheriff's log. The wrong physical description went into the missing person file. The search began with the wrong face. Lynn's friends and her boyfriend arrived at the hospital 30 minutes after she vanished, expecting an ordinary visit. They were told she had walked away. They scoured San Francisco for the next 2 weeks. They printed thousands of flyers. They walked the alleys of the Mission District. Tour bus operators distributed her photograph. The Facebook group called Find Lynn accumulated thousands of messages, most of them hopeful, some of them increasingly angry. The family operated under the reasonable belief that the hospital itself had been thoroughly searched. The hospital, in fact, had not been thoroughly searched. When the San Francisco Police Department requested surveillance footage from the day of her disappearance, the sheriff's department reported that the video equipment was malfunctioning due to hardware problems. The footage could not be retrieved for days. When deputies finally conducted what was described as a full sweep of the 24-acre campus, they failed to check every stairwell. After they realized this, a partial second sweep was conducted. Approximately half of the stairwells were checked. The other half were not. On October 4th of 2013, a doctor at the hospital reportedly noticed what looked like a body slumped in an exterior fire stairwell on the back side of one of the buildings. He told a nurse. The nurse told a dispatcher in the sheriff's department. The dispatcher told the nurse that a search of the stairwell would be conducted. NBC Bay Area later reported that no such search was conducted. 4 days later, on October 8th, an engineer doing a routine quarterly inspection of fire exits opened that same stairwell door and found the body of Lynn Spaulding, 17 days after she disappeared. The medical examiner determined she had died of an electrolyte imbalance consistent with dehydration. The exact moment of her death was never established. The dispatcher who failed to send a search team after the October 4th report was fired. 5 deputies were disciplined. 2 supervisors were suspended. The family received a $3 million settlement from the city and from the University of California, whose staff had been involved in Lynn's care. The pattern in the Spaulding case is not technological. The cameras were broken, yes, but the cameras would not have saved Lynn. By the time the cameras were checked, she had already walked into the stairwell. What killed her was something more fundamental than equipment. It was the moment a doctor saw what he thought might be a body, told someone, and was told back that the situation was handled. He believed it. He moved on. He went back to his shift. He was a doctor, not a security officer. The chain of accountability looked complete to him because everyone in the chain was performing their role. The dispatcher acknowledged. The deputy was supposedly dispatched. The check was supposedly logged. 4 days passed. Lynn was already dead when the doctor saw her, in all probability, but the institution could not have known that, because the institution did not actually look. There is a particular detail in the Spaulding case that I keep returning to. The stairwell where she was found exited the hospital grounds at the bottom. The door at the bottom was unlocked. If she had been able to walk all the way down, she would have stepped out into open air, into a neighborhood with bus stops and gas stations and people. She did not make it. The doors on every floor between the top and the bottom were locked from the stairwell side. Once she entered, she could not get back into the hospital. She could not call out to anyone. The walls of the stairwell are concrete, and the door is heavy and alarmed, except according to the family's attorney, the alarm did not function. Lynn walked into a sealed concrete tube inside the building she had come to for medical care, and she could neither leave nor return. The hospital was, in that moment, more difficult to escape from than a forest. A subsequent California Department of Public Health investigation, summarized in the contemporaneous press coverage, identified specific deficiencies in the staff response. The medical team had ordered that Lynn be checked every 15 minutes. The 15-minute order had been entered as a verbal instruction rather than as a documented standing order. There was no associated electronic alert in the bedside system. There was no nursing log entry showing that the 15-minute checks had been performed in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The morning shift had handed off to the day shift without flagging her elevated risk profile, in part because the elevated risk profile had never been formally added to her chart. Her medication, an antibiotic combined with a class of drug known to produce confusion in older patients, had been administered on schedule, but the nursing assessment of her mental status after administration had not been recorded. The medical examiner, after reviewing the toxicology, indicated that her blood chemistry at the time of death was consistent with several days of progressive dehydration. Lynn, in other words, didn't die immediately upon entering the stairwell. She lived for some unknown number of hours, possibly days, in a concrete enclosure with no water, no light at night, and no possibility of being heard. The exact interval is not knowable. The medical examiner could not establish a time of death with precision because of the temperature variability inside the stairwell over those 17 days. Sit with that detail. The medical examiner could not establish when she died, not because the body was tampered with, not because the scene was contaminated, because no one had checked the stairwell often enough, or in a regular enough pattern, for the time of death window to be narrowed. The stairwell was a black box. 5 years later, on the same hospital campus, a 75-year-old woman named Ruby Lee Anderson made a similar journey. Ruby had dementia. She had been diagnosed by her own physician at the Behavioral Health Center, located at 885 Potrero Avenue on the grounds of Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. Her doctor had recommended 5 months earlier that she be transferred to a skilled nursing facility better equipped to care for dementia patients. NBC Bay Area would later report that the transfer never happened. Ruby remained at the Behavioral Health Center, which was, by license, not authorized to care for residents with dementia. On the afternoon of May 19th of 2018, Ruby told a staff member that she was going to a nearby store to buy a hearing aid battery. She had 2 hearing aids. According to the lawsuit filed by her 4 children, she was also in cognitive decline severe enough that her physician had documented her as unsuited for independent outings. A staff member signed her out. She left alone. When Ruby did not return that night, staff at the Behavioral Health Center did not contact the Sheriff's Department until the following day, May 20th. The sheriff's deputies, who had jurisdiction over the hospital campus, treated the missing person report differently than they would have if Ruby had been a hospital patient. According to the sheriff's own statements at the time, the protocol after the Spaulding case required deputies to search every single nook and cranny of the campus when a patient is reported missing. Ruby was not a patient. She was a resident of a board and care facility located on the same campus. Therefore, deputies said, the campus search protocol did not apply to her. They called her family. They called the medical examiner's office. They called the local jail. They entered her information into a missing persons database. They circulated flyers around the hospital. They did not search the power plant building. The power plant building at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital is, by official policy, not accessible to the general public. According to the Department of Public Health, the building was supposed to be entered only by engineering staff. Hospital administrators later admitted that the building had in fact been left open during business hours between 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening to allow personnel and vendors to come and go. There were no cameras in the area where Ruby walked. There was no log of who entered or exited. On May 30th, 11 days after Ruby went missing, an engineer working in the building opened the door to a stairwell and found her body. The cause of death, as later reported in the public record, was consistent with kidney failure. The lawsuit filed by Ruby's children was settled by the city of San Francisco. The State Community Care Licensing Division threatened to shut down the residential care facility for the elderly and imposed a ban on the facility accepting any new dementia patients. The state cited the facility for failing to provide Ruby with appropriate care and supervision. The alarm on the stairwell door, according to the family's attorney, the same attorney who had represented the Spaulding family, did not sound when Ruby went through it. The same kind of alarm, the same kind of building, the same hospital campus, 5 years apart. When you place these two cases next to each other, the question stops being how this could have happened. The question becomes how it could have happened a second time. After $3 million in settlements, after firings, suspensions, and a publicly stated review of security policy, after a stated commitment to search every single nook and cranny when a patient went missing. The institutional answer, when pressed, was that Ruby was technically not a patient. She was a resident. Different protocol, different building, different policy chapter. The wall that should have caught her was a paragraph in a document, and that paragraph contained a definitional loophole large enough for a confused 75-year-old woman with dementia to walk through unnoticed and die a slow death of kidney failure on a concrete stairwell 11 days later. The institutional response to Lynn Spaulding's death did not actually address the failure that killed her. It addressed the wording of one specific protocol. The failure mechanism stayed intact. The next person to fit a slightly different definitional category was killed by the same architectural blind spot. The third case in this first section concerns a man whose name is Timothy White. Tim, as he was known. He was 62 years old. He was a United States Army veteran. He had recently undergone hip surgery. He had a history of homelessness. In early 2020, he was living in Building 5 on the campus of the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. The building was operated under an enhanced use lease by Caritas Communities, Incorporated, a nonprofit that provided independent living for veterans coming out of homelessness. Caritas leased the space from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The hallways and the stairwells of the building, however, remained VA property. On May 8th of 2020, Tim was last seen wearing a baseball cap, a Red Sox jersey, and jeans. He was reported missing 5 days later, on May 13th. The Bedford VA Police Department was notified. According to a 45-page report later issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General, the VA police chief at the time, Sean Kelly, did not order a significant search. He posted a photograph of Tim on a department bulletin board. He sent an email to officers. When the Bedford Town Police requested canine support to search the property, that request was reportedly not responded to for nearly 2 weeks. The canine search never happened. The reasoning given by the VA police in subsequent interviews with the Inspector General was that Tim was a resident of Caritas housing, not a VA patient. Therefore, in their understanding, the VA's missing patient protocol did not require them to search the inside of Building 5. They assumed Caritas had searched it. Caritas, in turn, had limited staff and limited authority. The hallways and stairwells inside the building were VA property. The leasing arrangement created a zone of mutual assumption. Each agency believed the other was responsible. On June 12th of 2020, another resident of the building opened the door to an emergency exit stairwell down the hall from Tim's apartment and found him dead on the concrete. He was wearing the same baseball cap, the same Red Sox jersey, and the same jeans he had been wearing on May 8th. The medical examiner could not determine the cause of death because of the delay in discovery. The body had been in the stairwell for so long that the autopsy could not establish whether Tim had died of natural causes shortly after entering the stairwell, or whether he had been injured or incapacitated for hours or days before death, suffering from dehydration or lack of medical attention. The Middlesex County District Attorney's Office investigated. It recommended no criminal charges, but described, in writing, a pattern of poor communication and an absence of policies and protocols which resulted in a failure for any agency to have clear and complete control over the stairwell where Mr. White was found. The VA Office of Inspector General concluded that the disappearance did not receive the attention it deserved from VA, an agency that is required by federal law to provide for the protection of all persons on its property. Former VA Police Chief Sean Kelly resigned during the investigation, cutting short his interview with investigators and citing health reasons. The stairwell where Tim was found was 60 feet from his room. 60 feet. He had not left the building. He had not crossed the campus. He had walked down a hallway. The VA's own statement, issued after the Inspector General's report, acknowledged that VA Bedford Police now conducted daily patrols of Building 5, including common areas and stairwells. The implication is that those daily patrols had not previously existed. The stairwell had been classified as a space no one was required to walk through. This is the wall of the room, the first kind of wall. And what these three cases share is not just the architectural feature of the stairwell. They share the institutional feature of the definitional gap. Lynn was a patient, but the search was incomplete because the campus was large and the stairwells were too many. Ruby was not a patient, she was a resident, so the search protocol was lighter. Tim was not a patient either, he was a resident, so the police did not search inside his own building. In each case, the institution had a category for the person, and the category did not require the search. Read the Inspector General report, the lawsuit filings, and the contemporaneous press together, and one fact becomes unavoidable. The lethal failure point in modern hospital architecture is not the moment the patient walks out of the room. It is the moment the staff stops checking, combined with the moment the institution assumes someone else is checking. That combination produces a body in a stairwell. Every time. There is a fourth case that belongs in this first section, and it does not involve a stairwell. It involves a roof. On the morning of January 22nd of 2025, around 4 in the morning, a 28-year-old woman named Chelsea Adolphus walked into Vista Medical Center East in Waukegan, Illinois. She was seeking medical treatment. The specific nature of her presenting complaint has not been publicly disclosed, in part because the family's wrongful death lawsuit is still active. She was admitted. She was assigned a room. According to a media briefing by Lake County coroner Jennifer Bannock, at around 2 in the morning on January 23rd, Chelsea left her room. She was wearing only a hospital gown. The temperature outside was in the low 20s Fahrenheit. The wind chill in some accounts was below zero. What Chelsea did during the next 6 hours and 45 minutes has not been fully reconstructed in the public record. What is known is that she made it onto the roof of the second floor of the hospital. The door she used, according to Coroner Bannock, was a door that, once exited, could not be reopened from the outside. There was no alarm on the rooftop access door. There was no camera covering the rooftop. There were no patrols of the rooftop. Chelsea was, from the moment that door closed behind her, sealed onto a flat concrete and gravel surface above the second floor of a hospital. In winter, in a hospital gown, with no way back inside. Just before 9 in the morning, the husband of another patient looked up through a window and saw a body lying on the roof. He alerted hospital staff. Chelsea was carried down to the emergency department, where her core body temperature was measured at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Hospital staff worked to rewarm her for 14 hours. At 11:03 in the evening, she was pronounced dead. The cause of death, as determined by autopsy, was hypothermia from cold exposure. What the public record indicates, beyond the autopsy finding, is a sequence of decisions by the hospital and its corporate parent that preceded Chelsea's death. About 2 weeks before her admission, Vista Medical Center East had furloughed 69 employees, citing financial pressures. Among the furloughed staff were sitters, the personnel whose job is to physically sit with patients who are at elevated risk of confusion, wandering, or self-harm. 1 year earlier, in February of 2024, the hospital had lost its designation as a trauma center because, according to Illinois regulators, it lacked essential services including a blood bank, anesthesia, neurology, urology, and a full-time trauma coordinator. The institution Chelsea walked into in January of 2025 was, by every available regulatory measurement, a degraded version of what it had been a year earlier. The family, represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The hospital, in response, filed an emergency injunction seeking to have Coroner Bannock removed from the investigation, on the grounds that some of her remarks at the press conference were, in the hospital's view, inaccurate. The injunction effort itself became part of the story. The Waukegan Police Department was not notified by the hospital when Chelsea died. The coroner's office was notified, and the coroner's office then notified the police. Chelsea's brother, Paul Adolphus, told reporters that hospital officials gave the family 3 conflicting accounts of how and where his sister had been found. One version, he said, suggested that she had slept on the roof. When you read the Adolphus case alongside Spaulding and Anderson and White, the pattern is no longer about stairwells specifically. The pattern is about a class of architectural feature that exists in every hospital, and that no one is specifically responsible for monitoring. Stairwells are one example. Rooftops are another. Power plant buildings are another. Mechanical corridors, underground tunnels, loading docks, construction zones, disused wings during renovation. These are the spaces where, in the words of the Bedford VA Inspector General, no individual, office, or decision can be pointed to as responsible. They are the spaces that belong to no specific protocol, and they are the spaces where the most vulnerable patients, the ones with confusion, dementia, mental health crises, or simply post-operative disorientation, are most likely to end up. Because the same things that make a stairwell or a rooftop unmonitored, the locked doors, the lack of alarms, the absence of cameras, also make them the kind of place a confused person is most likely to wander into and least likely to escape from. One more detail about Chelsea's case changes the texture of everything else. The hospital, in its written response to the coroner's preservation letter, acknowledged that the door Chelsea used to access the roof had a known mechanical issue. The door was supposed to lock from both sides under normal building configuration. At some point in the months preceding her admission, the locking mechanism had been altered, by whom and for what reason has not been publicly clarified, so that the door would lock only from the outside. This meant that any person, staff, or patient who passed through the door onto the roof could not return through the same door. The alteration was not, according to the available record, documented in the facility's safety management log. There was no warning sign on the door indicating the modified locking behavior. There was no posted signage indicating that the area beyond the door was a rooftop with no return access. Chelsea walking through that door in a hospital gown at 2 in the morning had no warning. She walked into a trap. The trap had been built accidentally by some unrecorded maintenance decision in the previous calendar year. The trap waited. Eventually, a patient walked through it. The mechanism was indifferent to who the patient was. It simply locked behind whoever entered. Step back from these 3 cases for a moment. The pattern they form goes beyond individual mistakes by individual hospitals. It is an architectural philosophy that has failed. American hospitals, and many hospitals abroad, were designed with 2 assumptions that are no longer true. The first assumption was that patients in a hospital are physically supervised at all times. That has not been true since the era of hourly nursing rounds was replaced by electronic call systems and reduced bedside staffing ratios. The second assumption was that the campus is a coherent whole, monitored as one space. That has not been true since hospitals began leasing portions of their property to outside operators, contracting out engineering and security, and dividing responsibility for residential care, behavioral health, and acute medical wings into separately licensed entities. The patient still believes she is inside one building, one institution, one chain of accountability. She is, in practice, walking through a checkerboard of overlapping authorities, each of which assumes one of the others is watching. The wall of the room is not a wall. It is a paragraph in a contract that no patient has ever read. The second wall is the wall of the camera, the wall of surveillance. The public assumption is that modern hospitals are saturated with video monitoring, CCTV in every hallway, recording everywhere. If a patient is missing, the footage can be reviewed and the patient can be located. This assumption is widespread, and it is, as the next two cases demonstrate, often wrong. Anthony Yusso went to the emergency room for an injured finger. He worked at the hospital. He never punched back in. For 5 days, his body lay in a bathroom on the 3rd floor of the same building where he had been employed for years. His family found him. The hospital did not. Anthony was 44 years old. He worked at Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx borough of New York City as a cleaner, responsible for the operating rooms on the 3rd floor. On Thursday, October 1st of 2015, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, he left his workstation to go to the emergency room. The injury was a cut to one finger. He was attended to by nurses. He was treated. He then walked back toward the 3rd floor where he worked. NBC New York and Becker's Hospital Review later confirmed the basic timeline. He stopped at a public bathroom on that floor. He entered. No one saw him again that day, or the following day, or for 3 days after that. Anthony's family began calling his cell phone Thursday evening when he did not come home. The phone went straight to voicemail. They called repeatedly through Thursday night, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They called the hospital. The hospital, in the family's later account to the New York Post, did not provide them with usable information. Anthony's family was told what amounted to a series of administrative non-answers. The hospital did not, by its own subsequent admission, conduct a meaningful internal search of the floors he was last known to have been on. He was an employee, not a patient, in the official categorization. He had clocked out, in a sense, by walking into the bathroom and not coming out. The hospital's missing person protocol, to the extent one existed for an off-duty employee whose last logged location was an ER bay, did not appear to have been activated. On Monday morning, Anthony's family went to the hospital in person. They demanded to view the surveillance footage. They demanded to see the floors. According to the family's account, only after they began, in their father's later phrasing, making a great deal of commotion, did hospital staff begin physically checking individual bathrooms on the 3rd floor. They found Anthony's body in a staff bathroom not far from the operating room area where he worked. He had been dead for some portion of 5 days. The medical examiner subsequently determined his cause of death from natural causes consistent with cardiac arrest. The family's statements to the press were not equivocal. Their position was that the hospital had made, in their words, no attempt to find him, and that he would have remained in that bathroom for another month if they had not arrived in person to force the search. The structural feature of this case matters more than the individual outcome. Anthony was an employee. The hospital tracked him through a time card system, a badge entry system, and a payroll system, all of which would have shown that he had not clocked out and had not returned to his workstation after his visit to the ER. The hospital had all the data it needed to know that an employee was unaccounted for somewhere on the premises. The data did not produce a search. The badge entry log did not generate a missing employee alert. The payroll system did not flag the discrepancy. The ER, having treated him for an injured finger, did not follow up to confirm he had returned to his shift. The 3rd floor staff, who would have noticed his absence over the course of the next workday, did not initiate a search beyond informal inquiry. Each system had information that, when correlated with information held by another system, would have indicated that something was wrong. No system was configured to correlate. The correlation, when it finally occurred, was performed by the family, who walked into the hospital lobby on Monday and refused to leave until the buildings were physically searched. The Ayuso case demonstrates that the wall of the camera is, even in a major American teaching hospital with a full surveillance system, not a wall at all. It is the assumption of a wall. Cameras exist, but no human eye is correlating the footage in real time against expected staff movements, routine bathroom checks, routine ward sweeps, routine head counts. When those routines collapse, even partially, The supposed safety provided by being in the medical ward of a public hospital simply ceases to exist. The patient is in a bathroom. The patient is dying. No one walks in. The building knows nothing. And the architectural feature that produced Anthony's death is not a feature unique to Montefiore, or to Bronx hospitals, or to American hospitals. The second case in this section comes from a different continent. The mechanism is the same: a body in a hospital ceiling. Not a stairwell, not a roof. Inside the suspended ceiling, tiles above the patient rooms. That is what police, hospital security, and construction workers eventually found in Stellenbosch Hospital, in the Western Cape province of South Africa, on the 13th day of a missing person search. His name was Teteteke Gkotsi. He was 61 years old. He was a father of 6. He lived in the township of Kayamandi, near Stellenbosch. In October of 2017, he had undergone abdominal surgery at the nearby Parel Hospital and had been transferred to Stellenbosch for further care. He was, according to Western Cape Department of Health spokesperson Mark van der Heever, under the active supervision of a nurse. The nurse left his bedside briefly to retrieve clean linens. When she returned, the patient was gone. Hospital management and the South African Police Service were both notified. Construction work was being done on the hospital at the time, which complicated the search. Police and hospital staff searched for 13 days. On the 13th day, the man's body was found in the ceiling of the hospital. Not on a roof, not in a stairwell, in the ceiling, in an isolated area of suspended ceiling space, difficult to reach, that ran above the standard occupied rooms of the facility. How a recently post-operative 61-year-old man with an abdominal incision climbed into the ceiling space, and what he was doing there during the time between when his nurse stepped away and when he died, has never been officially explained. The Western Cape Department of Health stated that the circumstances were being investigated. The official statement to the press at the time used careful, measured language. Sadly, the patient's body was discovered 13 days later in an isolated area in the ceiling, which is difficult to reach. The circumstances relating to how the patient got access to the ceiling are currently being investigated. To my knowledge, no full public conclusion of that investigation was ever released. There is a particular kind of horror in this case, and the language has to be careful. The horror is not in the physical location. The horror is in what the physical location tells you about the institutional gaze. A body found in the ceiling of a hospital, after 13 days of searching, after construction crews and security personnel and police officers had been moving through that building looking for him, means that no one in those 13 days had any reason to look upward. The ceiling is not a normal place a patient would go, and therefore the ceiling is not a normal place where institutional eyes travel. The patient was not on the missing person checklist of physical spaces. He was somewhere the hospital did not believe a patient could be. And so, until the smell of decomposition forced the discovery, the body was nowhere. The Stellenbosch case generalizes. The construction work being done on the hospital at the time of the disappearance is mentioned in the official statement as a complicating factor in the search. Hospitals under construction or renovation are a particular category of risk. The ordinary maps of who has access to what space stop applying. Contractors come and go with tool belts and clipboards. Suspended ceiling tiles are open. Drywall is incomplete. Mechanical rooms are unsealed. The institutional gaze is partially blocked by tarps, scaffolding, and posted notices indicating that certain areas are off-limits. A confused patient who slips past those notices walks from a monitored zone into an unmonitored zone. He may not understand he has crossed it. The hospital may not understand he has crossed it. The contractors are not part of the hospital's missing patient protocol. The hospital is not part of the contractor's headcount. The patient, between those two responsibilities, becomes invisible. Construction zones inside operating hospitals are the highest risk architectural configuration that exists in modern medicine. When such a zone is active, the search radius expands, the responsibilities fragment, and the architectural blind spots multiply. The wall of the camera, in both of these cases, is the wall of presumed observation. The institution believes it sees what it does not actually see. The patient is logged as present in a bed, present in a room, present in a ward. The system has him as a data point. The system never updates that data point because no human eye actually verifies it. The patient becomes a ghost in the record, physically present somewhere in the building, recorded as somewhere else. And the gap between the two locations is exactly large enough for him to die in without being seen. The third wall is the wall of discharge. The word discharge is doing more work in modern hospital practice than almost any other word in the medical vocabulary. To be discharged is to transition from being the legal and clinical responsibility of the institution to being responsible for yourself. The discharge papers are signed. The discharge instructions are explained. The discharge is logged, and the patient walks out into the world, presumed competent, to manage his own continued recovery. The next three cases concern patients for whom that presumption was, in retrospect, catastrophically wrong. On May 29th of 2023, a 32-year-old man from Brimfield, Illinois, was brought to Carle Health Methodist Hospital in Peoria. His name was Logan Dunn. He had type 1 diabetes and bipolar disorder. According to a doctor's affidavit, later attached to a wrongful death lawsuit filed by his parents, Brian and Heather Dunn, Logan was involuntarily admitted to the hospital's secured psychiatric floor for manic episodes. He was not taking his medication. He needed insulin for his diabetes and stabilization for his mental health crisis. On May 31st, 2 days after his admission, hospital staff transferred Logan from the secured psychiatric floor to an unsecured medical floor. The clinical reasoning, according to the lawsuit, was that he needed treatment for his uncontrolled diabetes on the medical floor and would then be transferred back to the secured psychiatric floor once the diabetic situation was stabilized. The transfer back to the psychiatric floor did not occur. According to the lawsuit, Logan spent the next 2 days on the unsecured medical floor, waiting for a bed to become available on the secured floor. On the morning of June 2nd, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, Logan put on his street clothes, walked out of his room, walked down the hallway, and walked out the front door of the hospital. Security camera footage, as Dateline NBC would later report, captured him exiting the building. The lawsuit alleges that he walked past staff members who knew him, who knew he was an involuntary admission, and who knew he should not be leaving. None of those staff members stopped him. When the Dunn family began calling the hospital later that morning to check on Logan, they were told, in the standard language of patient confidentiality, that the hospital could neither confirm nor deny that he was a patient there. According to the family, this response continued for the entire weekend. They believed Logan was being cared for. They believed he was on the secured floor. In reality, he had been missing since 5:30 in the morning on June 2nd, walking out of the hospital without his insulin in the middle of an unmanaged psychiatric crisis. The hospital's response, when they did finally acknowledge his disappearance, was that he had eloped. That is the term used in the medical record. A patient walking out of a hospital where he was being held involuntarily, without proper discharge, without medication, in mental health crisis, is described in the chart as having eloped. A word that, in any other context, would imply intent. In hospital parlance, it implies a routine and forgivable category of administrative event. Hundreds of people searched for Logan over the next 5 months. The search included Wildlife Prairie Park, Brimfield, Edwards, the wooded areas around Kickapoo Creek. National media attention followed. The Dunn family formed Logan's Army, a volunteer search organization. On November 12th of 2023, a hunter walking through the woods east of Kickapoo Creek found human remains. The remains, according to the Peoria County coroner, Jamie Harwood, were in a state of advanced decomposition. They were identified as Logan. The autopsy was, as the coroner put it in his subsequent statement, inconclusive. A forensic anthropologist was brought in to assist with the death investigation. In May of 2025, 2 years after Logan's death, his parents filed a 4-count wrongful death lawsuit against Methodist Medical Center. The lawsuit alleged improper training of staff on preventing patient elopement, failure to assign an in-person sitter to a high-risk patient, and the transfer from a secured to an unsecured floor of a patient who should not have been on an unsecured floor at any point in his admission. The hospital, citing state and federal patient privacy laws, declined to comment on the specifics of Logan's care. A spokeswoman for the hospital stated, in writing, that patient safety remained the hospital's highest priority. Read the affidavit, the lawsuit, and the timeline together, and the conclusion is unavoidable. The discharge framework was structurally incapable of protecting Logan. He was not formally discharged, he simply left, and the hospital's distinction between formal discharge and informal elopement is, from the patient's point of view, meaningless. He walked out the front door. He was a type 1 diabetic without insulin. He was in active manic crisis. He was incapable in any reasonable clinical assessment of taking responsibility for his own continued safety. The hospital had, 2 days earlier, made the clinical decision to move him to a setting where he could, in fact, walk out. That decision is the lethal decision in this case. Everything after it is consequence. If you want to understand why this kind of decision keeps happening, you have to understand the economics of hospital floors. Secured psychiatric beds are expensive and scarce. The demand for them, in every major American hospital, exceeds the supply by a significant margin. The decision to transfer a patient off the psychiatric floor to free up a bed can look clinical, but be logistical. The patient is moved because someone else needs the bed more urgently, and the moved patient is judged, by whatever criteria are available at the time, to be stable enough for a less secure setting. Logan was apparently judged that way. The judgment killed him. The economic dimension is the part of the conversation that hospital communications departments most consistently avoid. Secured psychiatric beds, in the American hospital system, cost the institution significantly more per day to operate than ordinary medical or surgical beds. They require higher staff-to-patient ratios. They require specialized nursing credentials. They require physical infrastructure, hardened windows, locked unit doors, monitored common areas that ordinary medical floors do not need. The reimbursement the hospital receives for a secured psychiatric admission from Medicare, Medicaid, and most private insurers is in many cases lower than what the same hospital would receive for the same patient on a medical or surgical floor receiving an equivalent intensity of care. The financial pressure on the part of the hospital is therefore to move psychiatric patients off the secured floor as soon as any clinical justification can be constructed. Diabetic stabilization is one such justification. A patient who needs insulin titration, the argument goes, is better managed on a medical floor where the endocrinology consult is available, with the unstated additional benefit that the medical floor is cheaper to operate and reimbursed more generously. The clinical logic and the financial logic point in the same direction. The patient is moved. The fact that the medical floor lacks the physical security required to manage an actively manic patient is, in the standard hospital workflow, treated as a manageable risk to be mitigated by additional precautions, such as the assignment of an in-person sitter. In Logan's case, the in-person sitter was not assigned. The risk was not mitigated. The patient walked out. The hospital's internal incentive structure had quietly produced a foreseeable, lethal outcome. I am not arguing that the staff at Methodist Medical Center made decisions in bad faith. I am arguing that the economic architecture of the American hospital system creates a structural pressure toward exactly the kind of bed assignment decision that killed Logan. The pressure is invisible to the individual nurse and the individual physician. It is built into the bed management software, the daily census report, the financial dashboard reviewed by the unit director, the quarterly performance review of the floor manager. By the time the decision reaches the patient, the decision feels clinical. The clinical framing is real. The economic framing underneath is also real. Both are operating simultaneously. The patient sees only the outcome. The outcome for Logan was a transfer to a floor he could walk off of, in clothing he had brought with him, past staff who recognized him. The second case in this section concerns a man whose disappearance is, as of the filming of this investigation, still unresolved. His name is Andrew Dumbrell. He is or was 35 years old. He lives or lived in Windale, New South Wales, Australia. He has schizophrenia. According to his family, he had never gone missing before in his life. On January 13th of 2025, Andrew suffered an epileptic seizure at home. He was transported by ambulance to the emergency department of Calvary Mater Hospital in Waratah, a suburb of Newcastle, in the Hunter region of New South Wales. He stayed overnight. On the morning of January 14th, he was discharged. ABC Australia would report that his family contests the medical reasoning behind the discharge of a man with schizophrenia and a history of epilepsy, after only a single night of observation. Andrew left the hospital and did not return home. Closed-circuit television footage later showed him near a McDonald's in Warners Bay at 4:30 in the afternoon on the same day. After that footage, he was not seen again. Andrew's mother, Angela Jackson, was notified of his disappearance the following day, January 15th, when Lake Macquarie police were informed. A missing persons investigation was opened. Police conducted 3 public appeals for information. Angela joined the appeal publicly in March. Specialist police searchers, accompanied by the New South Wales State Emergency Service, conducted an extensive search of bushland in the Warners Bay area on February 21st. The search included drone units and K9 teams. Nothing was found. In April, Andrew's family and friends conducted their own searches in Gateshead and Mount Hutton, suburbs frequented by Andrew before his disappearance. Nothing was found. In August of 2025, during the annual Missing Persons Week campaign, police renewed their public appeal. Andrew, at the time of his disappearance, was described by Lake Macquarie police as Caucasian, between 5'5" and 5'7" tall, of medium build, with gray hair and brown eyes. He was wearing a black t-shirt with a white logo, dark-colored shorts, and, significantly, no shoes. In subsequent interviews with the Australian press, Andrew's mother has spoken publicly about her belief that her son may have been the victim of foul play. She has shared her concerns with police. The investigation, as of the most recent public reporting, remains open. Andrew has not been found. The Andrew Dumbrell case adds something the others have not. It asks bluntly what discharge actually means when the patient being discharged is in active psychiatric vulnerability. The medical record reflects that on the morning of January 14th, Andrew was deemed clinically stable enough to leave. The seizure had been managed. The acute medical episode had passed. There is no indication in the available reporting that any handover was made to his family, or that any community mental health team was notified to follow up. He left the hospital alone, without shoes, and within hours he was inside the orbit of a McDonald's in a suburb a short drive from the hospital. And after that, the public record stops. The hospital, in its public statements, has denied any breach of discharge protocol. The family publicly disagrees. The truth, in the absence of a body or a witness or a definitive piece of evidence, is somewhere in the gap between those two positions, and that gap is, in this case, the size of an entire person who has now been missing for over a year. One detail about Andrew's discharge deserves to be underlined, because the official defense of the hospital systematically understates it. He left without shoes. A patient who is leaving the hospital in a clinically stable, cognitively appropriate state generally puts on his shoes before walking out the door. The absence of shoes on a January morning in coastal New South Wales is a clinical detail that carries weight. It is a behavioral indicator. It suggests that Andrew, at the moment of his departure, was not operating with the practical judgment that an ordinary discharge presumes. Whether that judgment was impaired by his underlying schizophrenia, by the post-ictal state following a seizure, by an undocumented adverse reaction to medication, by sleep deprivation in the emergency department, or by some combination of all of these, is a question the medical record could address. The medical record, however, is not public. What is public is the closed-circuit television footage showing him at the McDonald's at 4:30 in the afternoon, still without shoes, 6 hours after his discharge. The hospital did not, in any public statement, address why a man without shoes was permitted to leave the building unaccompanied. The absence of that explanation is the loudest silence in the public record of this case. The other detail worth drawing out is the geography. Andrew was discharged at Calvary Mater Hospital in Waratah. He was last seen at a McDonald's in Warners Bay. The distance between Waratah and Warners Bay is, by ordinary transit measures, a significant walk for a barefoot man. He may have taken public transport. He may have been given a ride. He may have walked. The public record does not specify. What the public record does specify is that no member of his family was at the hospital at the time of his discharge to provide transport, and that no hospital staff member is documented as having arranged transport. The standard discharge instruction in many hospital protocols requires verification of a safe transit plan for the patient. The verification is sometimes a phone call to a family member. It is sometimes a documented arrangement with a taxi or a rideshare service. It is sometimes a transfer to a community mental health team. In Andrew's case, none of these verifications appear in the public record. He simply walked. From the institution's perspective, he was no longer their problem. From the family's perspective, he was the same man with schizophrenia who, 20 hours earlier, had been brought to them by ambulance after an epileptic seizure. The institutional perspective and the family perspective diverged at the threshold of the front door. He stepped through. The hospital closed its file. The family opened a missing persons file. The third case in this section is the only one in this entire investigation in which the patient survived. He survived by a margin the medical staff who treated him described as a few hours. His name is Nick Shepard. He is 75 years old. He has been with his partner Janet Pott, a retired police worker, for more than 50 years. They never married. On a day in late 2025, Nick was taken to the emergency department of the William Harvey Hospital in Ashford, Kent, England. The hospital is operated by East Kent Hospital's University National Health Service Foundation Trust, which also operates Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother Hospital in Margate. Both hospitals, as Kent Online has reported, were among the worst performing in England for what the British National Health Service calls trolley waits, a term that describes the period of time between a clinician's decision to admit a patient and the actual provision of a hospital bed. When Nick arrived, the emergency department was over capacity. Janet, who has spent decades around police work and the criminal justice system, described the scene in subsequent interviews as resembling a war zone. The queue for treatment ran the entire length of the corridor. Patients were lying on trolleys in the hallway. Some were alone. Some had family with them. The hospital, on the same day Nick was admitted, was forced to convert its on-site coffee shop into a makeshift ward because the official wards were full, and there was nowhere else to put the patients who had been formally admitted. Nick spent a day and a half on a trolley in that corridor. Janet was with him for part of that time. She left to attend to other obligations. At some point during her absence, Nick stood up, walked out of the corridor, and left the hospital. He had not been discharged. He had not been moved to a bed. He was, in the language of the National Health Service, an inpatient awaiting transfer. The hospital did not, according to Janet's account, contact her to tell her that Nick had left. She arrived back at the hospital at one point and was given updates on Nick's pending treatment plan, in language that presumed he was still in the corridor. Closed-circuit television footage later confirmed that he had walked out of the building, wearing the same clothes he had fallen in the day before he was brought to the hospital. For 44 hours, Nick was missing. He had walked into woodland near the hospital and fallen into a drainage ditch. He was unable to climb out. Subsequent examination of his injuries indicated that he had tried, repeatedly, to climb the side of the ditch. The scratches on his arms and legs were deep. His ankles were cut. His feet were bleeding. He had not consumed water in nearly 2 days. The ambient temperature dropped sharply at night. He developed severe hypothermia. When searchers finally located him, he was alive, but only just. He was transported back to a hospital and admitted. He spent 19 days in intensive care, most of that time heavily sedated. He developed acute kidney failure. He suffered a gastrointestinal bleed that required multiple blood transfusions. He spent another 5 weeks in a general ward before he was finally well enough to be discharged. He survived. Janet has since spoken publicly about what she calls the worst 44 hours of her life. She has also said in print that she believes a great many people in Kent have lost faith in the National Health Service. The East Kent Hospitals Trust issued a statement of apology to Nick and his family. The statement included the phrase, "We are working with them to further investigate what happened and how lessons can be learned." The same statement acknowledged that the standard of care delivered to patients in corridors during periods of overcrowding was not the standard the Trust wished to deliver. The Trust did not, in any public statement, address the specific failure of the hospital to notice that Nick had walked out of the corridor and to alert his next of kin in real time. In the year of Nick's near death, 2025, the East Kent Hospitals Trust recorded more than half of all the 12-hour trolley wait incidents in the entire county of Kent. Across the county, there were 28,151 such incidents in 2025. In 2019, the comparable number had been 134. Nick's case demonstrates something the others have not. It shows the survival side of the same failure architecture. Nick did not die because he was found in time. He was found in time because of the combination of weather, his physical resilience, and a search effort that eventually mobilized. He survived. The architecture that lost him was identical to the architecture that killed Logan and that almost certainly killed Andrew. He simply, by accident, fell into a ditch close enough to be searched, in weather mild enough that hypothermia took longer than usual, and was retrieved by emergency services that arrived just before the irreversible threshold. Nick's case has a specifically British dimension. The National Health Service is a single-payer system in which the state is both the regulator and the operator of the hospitals. The financial pressure that distorts American hospital decision-making, the pressure to move patients off expensive floors and onto cheaper ones, takes a different form in Britain. The British pressure is volume. The number of patients moving through the emergency department on any given day exceeds the capacity of the wards to absorb them. Trolley waits, the term that has entered the British public vocabulary, are the visible symptom. A patient is admitted, meaning a clinician has decided the patient needs a bed. The bed does not exist yet. It will become available when another patient leaves, or dies, or is transferred. In the meantime, the patient lies on a wheeled stretcher in a corridor. Nick spent more than 30 hours on such a stretcher. He was not being treated during those 30 hours. He was waiting. The corridor was full of other patients waiting. The corridor, by Janet's description, ran the length of the emergency department. Some patients were alone because their families had gone home to sleep or to work, or because they had no families. The ratio of nursing staff to patients in such a corridor, in the worst cases documented in the British press, is 1 nurse to roughly 20 patients. The nursing function in that configuration is triage, not care. The nurse walks the corridor. The nurse notes who is deteriorating. The nurse cannot also notice who has stood up and walked out. The point to emphasize is that the British failure mode and the American failure mode produce the same outcome. A vulnerable patient walks out of a hospital that was supposed to be observing him, into woodland or roadway or open water, and is found later, sometimes alive, sometimes not. The institutional structures are different. The reimbursement mechanisms are different. The legal frameworks are different. The pattern is the same. The failure is not specific to American capitalism or to British socialized medicine. It is generic to any system in which the ratio of vulnerable patients to attentive staff exceeds a certain threshold, and in which the response to that mismatch is to redefine the threshold rather than to address the mismatch. Both systems are redefining the threshold. Both systems are losing patients. Place the cases of Logan, Andrew, and Nick next to each other. The pattern becomes harder to look away from. In all three cases, the hospital had information at the time of discharge or elopement that the patient was at significant risk. In all three cases, the hospital permitted or failed to prevent the departure. In all three cases, the hospital's first communication with the family was framed in language that obscured the risk. Logan's family was told the hospital could neither confirm nor deny he was a patient. Andrew's family was told the discharge had been appropriate. Janet was not told at all. Discharge is the legal moment when responsibility transfers from the institution to the patient. These three cases show that transfer happening when the patient is least capable of carrying it. That is not a bug. The economics of bed availability, the staffing shortages on secured floors, the financial penalties for long stays all push hospitals to discharge earlier and to treat elopement as a closed administrative file rather than an ongoing safety event. The discharge wall opens outward. The patient is permitted to walk through it. The institution closes the gap behind him and walks back to its workstation. By the time the family realizes what has happened, the patient is in a wood, on a roadside, in a ditch, or in a place no one will look for him. If your loved one is in a hospital with cognitive impairment, post-operative confusion, dementia, an acute psychiatric crisis, or any condition that affects judgment, here is what the cases in this section tell you to do. Do not accept the hospital's standard discharge protocol at face value. Ask in writing who has assessed the patient's discharge readiness, what their specific qualifications are, and what arrangements have been made for the first 48 hours post-discharge. If the answer is unclear, refuse the discharge. You have the right to do that. Insist on a family member or designated representative being physically present at the time of discharge. If the patient is being moved from a secured to an unsecured floor mid-admission, ask why, ask what the trigger was, and ask who specifically signed off on the move. Document the names. The documentation matters in court, but more importantly, it changes the institutional incentive. When staff know that their names will be on a document a family is reading carefully, the threshold for moving a vulnerable patient drops noticeably. This is not paranoia. This is the practical lesson of 3 separate wrongful death proceedings in 3 different countries. The fourth wall is the wall of the record. In every hospital in the developed world, the patient's location, status, and condition are tracked through an electronic medical record system. The record is the truth of the patient. If the record says the patient was admitted, the patient was admitted. If the record says the patient was discharged, the patient was discharged. If the record says the patient is in bed 3 of room 411, that is where the patient is. The record is treated as more authoritative than any human observation. And the next 2 cases are about what happens when the record is wrong, and no one in the institution is willing to look up from the screen and check. Jessie Peterson called her mother from the intensive care unit. She said she was being discharged. She asked her mother to come pick her up. A few hours later, she went into cardiac arrest. She died. Her mother arrived at the hospital expecting to take her daughter home. The hospital told her that Jessie had left against medical advice. That conversation took place in April of 2023. The next conversation took place a year and 4 days later, when a detective informed the family that Jessie's body had been in the hospital's morgue the entire time. Jessie was 31 years old. She lived in the Sacramento region of California. She had type 1 diabetes. She had been hospitalized for diabetic episodes before. In April of 2023, she was admitted to Mercy San Juan Medical Center in Carmichael, California, a suburb of Sacramento. Mercy San Juan is part of the Dignity Health Hospital Network, one of the largest Catholic health systems in the United States. According to the wrongful death lawsuit later filed by her family and reported by Reuters, The Guardian, and the Los Angeles Times, the phone call from the ICU was the last time her mother heard her voice. The hospital, by its own records, knew that she had died. Her body was moved on April 9th to an off-site facility known as Cremations Only, operated by Mortuary Support Services of Northern California. According to records later obtained by her family, Jessie's remains were placed on shelf number Red 22A. Her electronic medical record at the hospital was updated. But the field that was updated was not the death field. The discharge field was updated. According to the lawsuit, Jessie's record indicated that on April 8th, she had been discharged against medical advice. That is what her mother was told when she arrived at the hospital, expecting to take her daughter home. Jessie left against medical advice. We do not know where she went. For the next year, the Peterson family searched for Jessie. They filed missing persons reports. They distributed flyers. They asked homeless people in Sacramento if anyone had seen her. They contacted local police. They contacted the coroner's office. According to the family's lawsuit, when they contacted the coroner's office, they were told that no body matching Jessie's description had been found. In April of 2024, a year and 4 days after Jessie had actually died, a detective working the missing persons case was finally able to determine that Jessie's body had been in the off-site morgue used by Dignity Health the entire time. The death certificate was issued in April of 2024. The date of death recorded on the certificate was April 4th of 2024. The family's lawsuit notes that this date was, by every available piece of evidence, false. Jessie had died on April 8th of 2023. The death certificate had been backdated by a year to the day of its issuance. By the time the family was permitted to view what remained of Jessie, her body was in such advanced decomposition that no autopsy was possible. No determination of medical malpractice could be made. No open casket service could be held. The family filed a civil suit against Dignity Health, alleging negligent handling of remains, failure to timely issue a death certificate, failure to notify next of kin, and emotional distress so severe as to warrant punitive damages. The suit seeks $25 million in damages. The second case in this section is directly connected to the first. On November 2nd of 2023, a 51-year-old woman named Tanya Walker died at Mercy General Hospital in Sacramento, also part of the Dignity Health Network. Tanya had been brought to the emergency department with hypotension, hypothermia, and low blood sugar. She went into cardiac arrest. She was pronounced dead. Her family was not notified. Tanya had a history of homelessness and substance use, but she had remained in regular contact with her sisters. When she stopped answering their calls in early November, they grew concerned. They reported her missing to police on November 10th, 8 days after she had already died at the hospital. Her sisters, Daly Merez and Kalia Zachary, conducted what they later described as a 7-month search. They walked the streets of Sacramento. They distributed flyers. They engaged with online investigators. They offered a $3,500 reward. Local press coverage at the time documented that they were targeted by scammers offering false information about Tanya's location in exchange for payment. On May 31st of 2024, 7 months after Tanya had actually died, the Sacramento Police Department learned through a Department of Motor Vehicles flag that Tanya had been marked deceased. The sisters were directed to an off-site facility known as Cremations Only, operated by Mortuary Support Services of Northern California, owner Michael Lofton. The same facility, on the outskirts of Sacramento, that held Jessie Peterson's body. When Daly and Kalia arrived to identify Tanya's remains, what they saw cannot easily be described in clinical language. Her body had been in storage, unembalmed, for 7 months. Her eyes were missing. Her skin in certain areas was missing. The family later told reporters that staff at the facility tried to discourage them from viewing the body. They identified Tanya through a tattoo on her arm. According to the family's subsequent allegations and the civil lawsuit later filed by their attorney Rachel Fizet, Tanya's body had been processed for organ and tissue donation, while the family was still actively searching for her as a living missing person. No member of her family had been contacted for consent. The Walker case has not been adjudicated in court at the time of this investigation. The allegations remain allegations. Dignity Health, in its public statements, has emphasized its commitment to compassion, integrity, patient privacy, and the highest standard of care. The two cases, Peterson and Walker, were not the first cases of this type in the Dignity Health system to attract regulatory attention. They became part of a broader investigation into how the network's morgue and notification protocols had been functioning across multiple facilities over multiple years. The wall of the record, in modern American medicine, is the most opaque wall of all. The patient's body can be in the building. The patient's family can be calling the hospital every day. The patient's death can have already occurred. And the electronic record can say, in clinical and unambiguous language, that the patient was discharged and is no longer the institution's concern. The family is then directed to look for the patient under the presumption that the patient is still alive, while the patient's body is, often within walking distance, in a refrigerated drawer, that no one is checking against the active missing persons reports because the systems do not talk to each other. Hospital morgues, in many cases, are operated by separate contracted entities. The intake logs are not automatically reconciled with the patient discharge records. The result is a category of catastrophic failure that is functionally impossible to detect from outside the institution. The family cannot get the truth because the institution itself does not know the truth, because the institution's right hand has not been told what the institution's left hand has done. Now I am going to say the harshest thing in this investigation. When the hospital itself becomes the place where a body decomposes unnoticed, the question stops being about that hospital. The question becomes about every hospital that uses the same cold storage vendor, the same record-keeping software, the same notification protocol. Peterson and Walker were not the result of a single bad employee at any single facility. They were the result of an architecture of contracted death management, in which the body of a deceased patient is no longer the responsibility of the floor that treated her, no longer the responsibility of the doctor who declared her dead, no longer the responsibility of the unit clerk who logged the bed turnover. The body becomes a separate work order in a separate contractor's database, until that database is reconciled by a human being who decides to compare two spreadsheets. The body sits in limbo. The patient is dead. The system is treating her as discharged. The family is told she walked out. Every part of this is the consequence of design choices made by hospital administrators and the corporations they contract with. None of it is unavoidable. All of it is foreseeable in advance. Something has to be addressed explicitly. When you read about cases like Jesse Peterson and Tanya Walker, the natural reading is that the people who handled the bodies were uncaring, or careless, or malicious. I do not believe this is the correct reading, and I think the correct reading matters because if we misread the cases, we misread the necessary remedy. The people who worked at the off-site morgue used by Dignity Health were almost certainly competent, attentive professionals doing their jobs. The failure was not in how they did their jobs. The failure was in the design of the work itself. The morgue staff received bodies. They logged the bodies in their system. They preserved the bodies in the appropriate conditions. They waited for the discharging hospital to provide next-of-kin information so that the family could be contacted. The discharging hospital, in Jesse's case, never sent that information. The reason it never sent that information has not been fully explained in the public record. But the lawsuit alleges that the patient discharge record in the hospital's electronic system was updated with an incorrect status, which the morgue contractor had no way of independently verifying. The morgue stored the body. The hospital, by its own records, had no body to follow up on. Both contractors were doing their jobs according to the data each had received. The data was wrong. No human being noticed for a year. This is what an institutional failure looks like when you examine it at close range. It does not look like cruelty. It looks like ordinary people doing the work in front of them, with no system in place to detect that the work in front of them did not match the work that should have been in front of them. There is also a deeper question raised by the alleged organ and tissue harvesting in the Walker case, and it needs to be addressed directly, because the allegation, if true, is among the most disturbing in this investigation. The allegation, again, is that parts of Tanya Walker's body, her eyes and certain areas of skin, were missing when her family was finally permitted to examine the remains. The family has alleged that these were harvested for donation purposes without consent. I do not know whether this allegation will be proven in court. What I do know is this: the framework of post-mortem tissue recovery in the United States operates through arrangements between hospitals and organ procurement organizations that are sometimes opaque to families. Tissues recovered include corneas, skin, bone, heart valves, and other materials. The recovery is supposed to occur only with documented consent from next of kin, except in a narrow class of circumstances where state law provides for presumed consent in the absence of an objection on file. When a patient dies and the family has not been notified, the question of whether anyone with the legal authority to consent or refuse was ever contacted becomes a question with deeply uncomfortable implications. If the Walker allegations are upheld in court, the implication is that the institution, having failed to notify the family that the patient had died, proceeded to make decisions about the body that only the family had the legal standing to authorize. That is not a clerical error. That is a chain of decisions in which the institution acted on behalf of a family that did not know it had become bereaved. The court has not yet ruled. The allegation will not be overstated here, but its structure is consistent with the pattern this investigation has been documenting. The institution's relationship to the patient continued after the patient's death in ways the family did not authorize because the institution had stopped tracking the patient as a person and had begun tracking her as a resource. Whether that framing was conscious or unconscious on the part of the staff involved is a question for the lawsuit and the regulators. The framing itself, however unconscious, is part of what this investigation is examining. The fifth and final wall is the wall of the hospital boundary itself. The moment the patient crosses the perimeter, walks off the grounds, enters the world. The previous sections concerned patients who never made it past the building. This one concerns a patient who did make it past, and was then swallowed by the gap between hospital responsibility and police responsibility, between hospital records and police records, between the moment the patient is logged as missing and the moment, if ever, the patient is found. Leonard Mercury broke a window. He was on the second floor of a psychiatric evaluation unit. He jumped onto the bushes below. He had no shoes. He was wearing hospital pants and a hospital shirt. The temperature that night was below freezing. He walked toward the woods. His wife had brought him in that night, signed him in for evaluation, and gone home. By the time the hospital called her back to the property, he was already gone. Leonard was 57 years old. He lived in Acton, Massachusetts. He and his wife Nicole Laguerre had been together since they were teenagers. They had 2 sons. They had faced his previous mental health episodes together, and Nicole had been the one to bring him to Haywood Hospital in Gardner that night, as she had before. The date was October 31st of 2025, the night of Halloween. He had been admitted for evaluation in the early hours, sometime before 2 in the morning. Nicole was notified by the hospital. She drove to the property. She walked the bike path. She walked the woods behind the hospital. She walked them again. She walked them dozens of times in the weeks that followed. The Gardner Police Department conducted an initial search. When that search did not locate Leonard, additional agencies were contacted. The Westminster Police Department, the Massachusetts Environmental Police, the Massachusetts State Police Dive Team, the Massachusetts State Police Special Emergency Response Team, the Massachusetts State Police Marine Unit, and the Massachusetts State Police K-9 Unit all contributed to the search at various points. The Central Massachusetts Search and Rescue Team conducted ground sweeps. A private investigator retained by the family told reporters that given Leonard had only hospital clothing and no shoes, hypothermia was the immediate medical concern. The family searched into November, into December, into the new year. Nicole told reporters that she spent most days really angry. She said the question that did not leave her was, "Where are you?" The hospital, When contacted by journalists about its window security on a psychiatric evaluation unit, did not respond. On March 25th of 2026, nearly 5 months after Leonard disappeared, the Gardner Police Department conducted an aerial drone survey of Crystal Lake. The lake is a body of water within the search radius behind the hospital. The drones identified what appeared to be a human body floating in the water. The Massachusetts State Police dive team was deployed. The body was recovered. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner identified the remains as Leonard. The investigation into the cause and manner of death remains active at the time of this filming. No public conclusion has been issued regarding why a body that had been in or near that lake for some portion of those 5 months was not located in any of the earlier searches. The drones had not been deployed during the earlier searches. The dive team had been deployed earlier, but to other portions of the surrounding water. Leonard's case represents the moment the institutional wall stops being a wall and starts being a horizon. He left the hospital. He did so in a way that almost certainly involved physical injury, given the fall from the 2nd floor. He moved across the grounds. He went into the woods. From the perspective of Haywood Hospital, the failure was the unsecured window. From the perspective of the Gardner Police, the failure was a search radius that did not encompass the lake until very late in the timeline. From the perspective of Nicole and her sons, the failure was that Leonard, a man with a documented mental health crisis, in hospital clothing, with no shoes, was permitted to make it from a 2nd-floor evaluation room to a lake more than a mile away, without being intercepted by anyone. The hospital's responsibility, as the hospital defines it, ended at the perimeter. The police's responsibility, as the police define it, began only after the missing person report was filed and processed. There is a gap between those two responsibilities. Leonard fell through it. Consider the physics of Leonard's departure for a moment, because the physics tell us something about institutional design. The window he broke was, by ordinary architectural standards, not a security barrier. Standard hospital windows on psychiatric evaluation floors in many American hospitals are not constructed to the same security specifications as windows on locked psychiatric units. The reasoning, when this is explained by hospital administrators, is that the evaluation floor is meant for short-term observation rather than for involuntary commitment, and that hardening every window in the facility would impose costs the institution is unwilling to absorb. The result is that the difference between a window a patient can break and a window a patient cannot break depends entirely on the administrative classification of the floor, not on the actual clinical status of the patients on the floor. Leonard was, by Nicole's account, and by the hospital's own admission that he was in a mental health crisis, exactly the kind of patient for whom the window should have been hardened. He was on a floor where the windows were not hardened. He broke through. The administrative classification was the only thing standing between him and the world outside, and the administrative classification was made of paper. The second observation about Leonard's case is about the temperature of the night he disappeared. Halloween in central Massachusetts is a transitional period in the local weather pattern. The overnight low temperatures in Gardner on October 31st of 2025 were, by available meteorological records, below the threshold at which an unshod man in light hospital clothing can maintain core body temperature for more than a few hours. His private investigator was right to identify hypothermia as the immediate medical concern. If Leonard had remained anywhere accessible to a search team, even within a half-mile of the hospital, his survival window was on the order of hours, not days. The early searches, conducted by Gardner Police and the various state agencies, were operating under that time pressure. They did not search the lake initially because the lake, on the night of his disappearance, was not the obvious destination. By the time the aerial drone survey identified his body in March of the following year, the lake had been frozen for a portion of that interval, and ice covered for additional weeks. The body surfaced in March. The lake had been releasing what it had been holding through the winter. There is a question that has to be asked, and it will be left unanswered because the answer is not available in the public record. The question is whether Leonard reached the lake while still alive, And if so, whether he entered it voluntarily or involuntarily, and if voluntarily, what state his mental health crisis had reached by that point. The medical examiner's determination of cause and manner of death has not been publicly issued at the time of this filming. The investigation is ongoing. Whatever the answer turns out to be, the question is one the hospital should have made impossible to ask. The hospital should have intercepted him in the first 100 yards. The hospital did not. The lake answered the question the hospital should never have allowed to be asked. One final observation before the analytical block. The cases in this investigation have moved through 5 categories of institutional failure: the wall of the room, the wall of the camera, the wall of discharge, the wall of the record, the wall of the boundary. And what becomes clear when you place all 12 of these cases on a single table is that they are not 5 different failures. They are one failure, looked at from 5 different angles. The failure is the assumption on the part of the institution that someone else is checking. The nurse believes security is checking. Security believes the cameras are checking. The cameras believe the system is recording. The system believes the next shift will review. The next shift believes the discharge was clean. The discharge believes the family is informed. The family believes the hospital is searching. The hospital believes the police are searching. The police believe the hospital has more information. Around and around. At no point is there a single individual whose job is, definitively and exclusively, to confirm that the patient is alive and where the institution last recorded her as being. There is no such role in the modern hospital. The role does not exist. Its absence is the architecture of every case we have just walked through. There is a name for what I am describing. It is called diffusion of responsibility. Every staff member, every protocol, every surveillance system is a bystander to the patient. The patient is the emergency. The patient may not be an acute emergency at the moment of admission, but the patient is, by definition, a person in some degree of vulnerability who has voluntarily entered an institution premised on the institution's ability to monitor and respond. The diffusion of responsibility has the same structural shape every time it appears. Multiple parties believe one of the other parties is watching. None of them is. The remedy, when this dynamic appears in cases of emergency intervention, is to point at one specific person and assign sole responsibility. You, in the red shirt, call 911. The act of specification produces action. In some specialized contexts, hospitals do implement this remedy. The in-person sitter that Logan should have had and did not have is exactly this kind of specified responsibility. A single staff member is physically present in the room. The responsibility is not diffused. The protocol works. Patients with assigned sitters do not, by and large, walk off the floor. The problem is that the in-person sitter is treated as a costly exception rather than as the operational default for any patient whose cognitive status places her at elevated risk. The exception is granted only in a minority of the cases where it would have prevented the death. The majority of vulnerable patients are absorbed by the regular nursing staff, who are themselves absorbed by another dozen patients on the same shift, and the responsibility, having no specific name attached to it, diffuses across the unit and produces, predictably, a small number of bodies in stairwells and rooftops and lakes every year. Ask the question directly. Why does this pattern continue? I have been reading about these cases for some time, and the answer, when I separate it out from the hospital press releases and the regulatory statements and the legal language of the wrongful death suits, is uncomfortable. The pattern continues because no individual hospital has a strong enough incentive to change it. Each wrongful death case is settled. The settlements are paid out of insurance pools. The insurance premiums increase modestly. The hospital makes minor protocol adjustments, such as the daily VA police patrols of Building 5 that began at Bedford only after Tim was found, or the badge access requirement at the San Francisco General Power Plant that began only after Ruby was found. The protocol adjustments address the specific architectural feature that killed the specific patient. They do not address the underlying definitional gap that produced the failure. And so, the next patient, who does not match the specific definitional profile of the previous patient, finds her way through a slightly different gap, and the cycle restarts. The forest is indifferent. The forest does not pretend to protect you. When a person disappears in a national park, the failure mode is honest. The wilderness is large, the trails are many, the searchers are limited, and the outcome is sometimes tragic. No reasonable person expects a forest to know where every hiker is at every moment. The expectation, when one enters a forest, is one of contingent safety. You are responsible for your own preparation, your own equipment, your own decisions, your own water, your own warmth. A hospital pretends. A hospital, by its design, by its signage, by its advertising, by its accreditation, by its regulatory framework, presents itself as the opposite of a forest. A hospital is the place where the institution takes responsibility. The patient is admitted. The wristband is applied. The bed is assigned. The chart is opened. And the patient enters a space in which the contingent safety of the forest is replaced by the structural safety of the institution. That is the contract. That is the entire premise of why a hospital exists, rather than a triage tent in a field. And what the 12 cases in this investigation document is that this contract is, in many actual hospitals, on many actual days, no more enforceable than a contract written on water. The patient enters believing she is now in a structured environment. The structure, as we have seen, contains stairwells no one walks through, rooftops no one watches, bathrooms no one inspects, ceilings no one looks into, cold storage drawers no one reconciles against missing persons reports, windows that can be broken from the inside, doors that lock behind the patient, alarms that do not sound. The patient is, in a precise sense, in a forest. She does not know she is in a forest. She believes she is in a hospital. The institution allows her to believe this. The institution profits, in many cases literally, from this belief. And then, in a small percentage of cases, the belief turns out to have been incorrect, and the patient dies in a place she never knew she was, and the family is left to discover, by lawsuit or by Inspector General report or by coroner's press conference, that the hospital was, all along, a forest with a roof. This is the harshest version of the analysis, and it is also the most accurate. The wilderness does not pretend. The hospital pretends. The pretension is the failure. A careful clarification matters here. Hospitals are not net negative institutions. They are not. The overwhelming majority of admissions end with the patient discharged, alive, and improved. The statistics are real, and they are good. The cases gathered here are a small percentage of total admissions. But the small percentage matters because of two things. First, when it happens to your family, it does not feel like a small percentage. It feels like a complete betrayal of the institutional contract. Second, the small percentage is concentrated in a specific population: patients with cognitive impairment, patients with dementia, patients with acute psychiatric crisis, patients with post-operative confusion, patients with sensory impairments, patients with substance use disorders who present in altered states, patients who are homeless and have nowhere else to go after discharge. In other words, the patients least able to advocate for themselves. The patients who arrive at the hospital with the least social and economic protection. The patients for whom the structural safety of the institution is most necessary, and for whom that structural safety, in these 12 files, is most frequently absent. There is a phrase that comes up repeatedly in the public records associated with these cases. The phrase is, "The patient eloped." Eloped, from the Latin meaning to leap out. In hospital documentation, the word is used to describe any patient who leaves the institution without proper discharge. Logan eloped. Nick eloped. Leonard eloped, though in his case the verb is somewhat literal given the second-floor window. Andrew, depending on the framing the hospital prefers, may also have eloped, though he had been formally discharged. The word is used because it sounds clinical. It sounds, in a chart, like an administrative event of moderate significance. It does not sound like what it actually is, which is the moment the institution loses physical contact with a vulnerable human being for whom the institution had, until that moment, accepted custodial responsibility. Replace the word eloped with the word lost. The patient was lost. Logan was lost. Nick was lost. Leonard was lost. Now read the chart again. The institutional softness of the original word becomes apparent. Eloped implies the patient acted. Lost implies the institution failed. The choice between those two words is a political choice that hospitals make every day in their documentation, and the political choice favors the institution every time. The state-level data on this is worth reading aloud. In California in 2011, the most recent year for which a comprehensive statewide figure was reported in the news coverage of the Spaulding case, 38,333 patients either left a hospital without informing staff or signed out against medical advice. 38,333 in one state, in 1 year. Most of those patients were not vulnerable in the way the patients in this investigation were vulnerable. Most of them went home and were fine. But the rate of elopement establishes that the institutional system is built to absorb large numbers of patients walking out without being stopped. It is not an anomaly. It is the operational baseline. In Kent, England, in 2025, the year Nick nearly died, there were 28,151 instances of patients waiting 12 or more hours on a trolley after a decision had been made to admit them. In 2019, that figure had been 134. The ratio between those two numbers, 134 versus 28,000, is the architectural transformation of an entire health system over 6 years. The architecture has changed faster than the public's understanding of the architecture has changed. The patient and the family still arrive at the hospital expecting the standard of care that prevailed in 2019. They are receiving the architecture of 2025. They do not, in most cases, know the difference until something catastrophic happens. Here are the practical recommendations. The cases in this investigation matter because of what they document, but they matter more because they suggest specific actions for anyone with a family member, particularly an older or more vulnerable family member, who is admitted to a hospital. I am not a clinician. I am a documentary investigator. What follows is drawn directly from what the case is reviewed here, and the legal proceedings around them indicate would have made the difference in those specific cases. First, if your family member is in a hospital with cognitive impairment, post-operative confusion, dementia, an acute mental health crisis, a recent seizure, or any condition affecting judgment, do not rely on the hospital's standard observation routine. Hire a family sitter, assign a rotating family schedule, or, if you can afford it, pay for a private patient companion. The role of the sitter is to physically be present and visually verify, by direct observation, that the patient is where the chart says the patient is. The hospital may tell you a sitter is not necessary. Across the 12 files reviewed here, the absence of a sitter was, more than once, the proximate cause of the failure that led to the death. Chelsea was admitted at a hospital that had recently furloughed its sitter staff. Logan was not assigned an in-person sitter, despite being involuntarily admitted with manic episodes and uncontrolled diabetes. The lack of a designated set of eyes on the patient is the single most common point of failure across these cases. Second, verify the patient's location by physical presence, not by phone. Every 4 to 6 hours, walk into the room. Do not call the nurse station and accept the answer. The phone confirms the chart. The chart, as the Peterson and Walker cases demonstrate, can be wrong. The physical visit confirms reality. Third, if the hospital tells you the patient has been discharged, has eloped, has left against medical advice, or has otherwise departed without your knowledge, immediately request written copies of the discharge paperwork. the elopement incident report, and the closed-circuit television footage from the relevant entry and exit points. The hospital is required to maintain this documentation. You may not be granted access immediately, but the request itself triggers preservation. The request must be in writing and dated. Fourth, if the hospital invokes patient privacy laws, the so-called Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, to refuse to tell you whether your family member is or was in the hospital, you have specific rights as next of kin in cases of incapacitation, missing person status, or post-mortem inquiry. Patient privacy is not an absolute. It is a regulatory framework with specified exceptions, several of which apply to family members searching for missing patients. Push back. Document the refusal. The Logan Dunn case directly involves a multi-day period in which the hospital invoked patient privacy to refuse to confirm or deny his presence, during which time he was already missing and his life was in danger. Fifth, if you are present at the time of discharge for a patient who appears clinically unfit to leave, refuse to take them home. Document your refusal. Insist on a clinical reassessment by a physician, in writing, with the physician's name and credentials recorded. The discharge process, as the cases demonstrate, often pushes vulnerable patients out of the hospital faster than is clinically appropriate. The push is largely economic. The countervailing force is family pressure. Use it. Sixth, if something has already gone wrong, if the patient is already missing or already deceased under unclear circumstances, document everything from the first hour. The names of the staff you spoke with, the exact times of the calls, the names of the supervisors, the discharge times listed in the system, the dates and times the hospital first acknowledged the disappearance to you. The discrepancies, when they appear, will appear small. They will appear like clerical errors. They are, in many of these files, the visible traces of larger systemic failures. The documentation matters in court. More importantly, it matters in regulatory complaints. The State Department of Health, in every state in the United States, accepts complaints from family members. The Joint Commission, the accreditation body for hospitals, accepts complaints. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services accept complaints. Hospitals respond to complaint volume in ways that they do not respond to individual incidents. 12 carefully documented complaints, filed by 12 different families, do more to change institutional behavior than a single lawsuit settled out of court. Seventh, know what the existing regulatory triggers actually are. A patient elopement, in many states, is classified as a sentinel event, which means the hospital is required to conduct a formal root cause analysis and report findings to the relevant accreditation body. Many families do not know that this requirement exists. They accept the institution's informal explanation. Ask in writing whether a root cause analysis has been completed, and request a summary of the findings. The hospital may decline to share the full document on confidentiality grounds, but the existence of the analysis itself is public information. The absence of an analysis, when one is required, is itself a regulatory violation. Documenting that absence creates leverage that does not otherwise exist. Eighth, if your family member is being admitted with cognitive impairment, take a photograph of them at the moment of admission in the clothing they are wearing, and provide the photograph to the admitting staff to be attached to the chart. This is not standard practice in most hospitals. The Tim White case is in part a case in which the only way investigators could confirm the man found in the stairwell was the missing man was that he was wearing the same baseball cap and Red Sox jersey he had been wearing 5 weeks earlier. Photographs at admission are a low-cost, high-value safeguard that any family can request. Hospitals will sometimes resist, citing privacy concerns. The privacy is your family member's privacy. You are the one requesting the photograph. The argument is not a serious one. Ninth, if your family member has dementia or a related cognitive disorder, request in writing that the hospital provide its missing patient protocol. Read it. Compare it to the protocols described in the public records of the cases reviewed in this investigation. particularly the Anderson case. If the protocol does not include a specific provision for searching all stairwells, all rooftops, all mechanical spaces, and all off-site morgue and cold storage facilities within a defined response window, the protocol is structurally insufficient. The hospital may not be willing to amend the protocol for one patient, but the request itself is part of the documentation trail that, if something happens, will be the difference between a settled lawsuit and a regulatory consent decree that changes the protocol for everyone. 10th, if a death occurs in the hospital and you are not notified within a reasonable time window, define reasonable in your written correspondence as 24 hours, file a complaint with the State Medical Board, the State Department of Health, and the hospital's own patient advocate office, in that order, in writing, with documentation. The Peterson case is a case in which an entire year passed before the family was notified of a death the hospital had documented. That interval was not the result of a single mistake. It was the result of a notification protocol that did not contain a mandatory time deadline. Time deadlines in institutional documentation are the difference between a system that fails open and a system that fails closed. One final thing before we close, and it is about the families in these cases. Lynn's friends and her boyfriend, Ruby's 4 adult children, Tim's family in Massachusetts, Chelsea's brother Paul, Anthony's father and brother, who stood in the lobby of Montefiore Medical Center on a Monday morning and refused to leave until the bathrooms were checked. Teteteka Gaotzi's brother Christmas and his daughter Nopink, who still have no real answer for how their father ended up in a ceiling. The Dunn family, who formed Logan's army. The Adolphus family. The Peterson family, who hired private investigators while their daughter was in a refrigerator drawer. The Walker family, whose 7-month search ended in an off-site morgue. Andrew's mother, Angela Jackson, who is still searching as of the most recent reporting available. Janet, who waited 44 hours and watched Nick come back almost dead. Nicole, who walked the woods behind Haywood Hospital so many times she lost count. These families are, in a particular sense, the parallel investigators in every one of these cases. They are not waiting for the institution to find their loved ones. They are finding them, or trying to. They are printing flyers. They are walking the woods. They are calling every hospital. They are forming armies. They are hiring private investigators. They are filing public records requests. They are giving press conferences. They are, in the absence of an institutional system that does its job, doing the work themselves. And what becomes clear, reading their statements one after another, is that they were never supposed to be in this position. They were supposed to be at the bedside. They were supposed to be in the waiting room. They were supposed to be reading the discharge instructions. The hospital was supposed to do the rest. The fact that the families are doing the search in case after case is the evidence that the institution is not doing its job. The families are doing the institution's job, and they are doing it without resources, without authority, and without the cooperation of the institution that should be helping them. Something about the emotional cost of this work has to be acknowledged, because it is not visible in the legal filings. The Dunn family spent 5 months searching for Logan. They led volunteer search parties through wooded areas around Kickapoo Creek. They mobilized hundreds of community members. They organized social media campaigns. They gave interviews to national television. They did this while continuing to work, to care for their other family members, to manage their own grief in the absence of a body to grieve. When the body was finally found, by a hunter, in a state of advanced decomposition, the family was not relieved. The coroner stated explicitly that this was not the closure they had been looking for. They had been looking for Logan. What they received was confirmation that Logan had been dead for almost the entire period of the search. Every flyer they had printed, every press conference they had given, every prayer they had been offered for a son who was already, in fact, beyond reach. The institutional failure that produced that interval, between the moment of his actual death and the moment of his discovery, is the same institutional failure that produced the interval in every other case examined here. The family does not get those months back. The interval is irretrievable. It is, in its own way, an additional injury that the institution inflicted, separately from the injury of losing the patient in the first place. There is a moment in the Spaulding case that I cannot stop thinking about. After Lynn was found in the stairwell, after the autopsy, after the press conferences, after the lawsuit, after the $3 million settlement, a journalist asked a representative of the family how the family was processing the death. The representative, David Perry, said a single sentence that I am going to paraphrase rather than quote at length, in keeping with the principle that paraphrase is more accurate than reproduction. He said that Lynn had died alone in a stairwell in one of the finest medical institutions in the country. He said it with the particular weight of someone who had not yet processed the contradiction inside the sentence he had just spoken. The finest medical institutions. Alone. In a stairwell. The sentence contains its own collapse. The fineness of the institution and the aloneness of the death cannot, in the same building, exist in the same week without one of them being false. What the 12 cases in this investigation indicate is that more often than the public realizes, it is the fineness that is false. The fineness is the press release. The fineness is the brochure in the waiting room. The fineness is the magnetic resonance imaging machine on the 3rd floor, which is real, and the fellowship-trained surgical staff in the operating wing, which is real, and the accreditation plaque in the lobby, which is real. The fineness is real, and it coexists in the same building, on the same campus, with the stairwell where the alarm does not work, and the roof where the door locks behind you, and the cold storage drawer that no one reconciles against the missing persons list. Both are simultaneously true. The patient walks into a place that is, at once, an institution capable of saving her life, and an institution capable of losing her so completely that her body is found by accident, weeks later, by an engineer doing a quarterly inspection. The two institutions are the same institution. They share a wristband. They share a chart. They share a discharge protocol. The patient does not know, when she arrives, which version she is going to receive. Echo 7 exists, in part, to document the version that the press releases do not describe. The version where the institution fails. The version that is, in most cases, recoverable by reading the Inspector General reports and the court filings and the contemporaneous press carefully, slowly, and in cross-reference. The records are public, or near enough to public that a patient member of the public can assemble them. The cases are documented. The pattern is visible. If anything in this investigation matches something you have seen happen to your own family, leave it in the comment section. Use specific institution names. Use approximate dates. Do not include information that could identify a still living patient without their consent. Documented patterns get noticed by regulators when comment sections start matching public records. The cases here are real. The patterns are real. The next case is, statistically, currently in a hospital somewhere. The wristband has already been applied. The chart has already been opened. Whether the case becomes the 13th case in a future investigation depends on a series of small decisions, made by a series of individual staff members in a series of specific buildings over the next 24 to 72 hours. The decisions are not predetermined. They are made by people. The people respond in measurable ways to the awareness that the public is watching. They came carrying insurance cards and identification and the reasonable belief that a hospital is the safest place a sick person can be. They came to be found. They came to be cared for. They came because the alternative, going without medical attention in a moment of acute crisis, was worse. The institution received them. The wristband was applied. The bed was assigned. The chart was opened. The discharge was planned. The protocol was followed. And then, in a way that the institution itself, after the fact, has been unable to fully explain, the institution stopped seeing them. Not in a forest, not on a mountain, not in a national park, in a hallway, in a stairwell, on a roof, in a ceiling, in a bathroom, in a cold storage drawer, in a lake less than 2 miles from the front door of the building where they were last logged as present. The hospital lost them. The records lost them. The cameras lost them. The cameras that worked lost them anyway, because no one watched the footage in time. The pattern is not random. The pattern is documented. The pattern continues. And the only force that has been demonstrated to interrupt it is the family who refuses to accept the institution's first answer, who keeps asking, who keeps walking the property, who keeps filing the records requests, who keeps printing the flyers, who keeps showing up. Be that family, before it is necessary. The cases continue. The wristbands continue to be applied. The patients continue to walk into the institutions that lose them. The institutions continue to issue the press releases that describe their excellence. The press releases continue to be true and false at the same time. And the next person to be lost is, right now, in a room with a chart and a bed number and a nurse assigned to check on her every 15 minutes. The check, in some percentage of cases, will not happen. The room will be empty. The protocol will be followed. The wristband will be on the body when it is finally found, often by accident, often by a stranger, often days or weeks or months after the family was first told that the patient had walked away. The institution will issue a statement. The statement will use the word elopement, or the phrase against medical advice, or the language of internal review. The family will file the lawsuit. The settlement will be paid. The protocol will be modestly adjusted. The next patient will arrive. The wristband will be applied. The cycle will resume. This is not how it has to be. The architecture is built. The architecture can be redesigned. The redesign requires only that the public stop accepting the institution's first answer about what happened. The 12 patients examined here lost their lives, or in one case, nearly lost his, because the institution's first answer was accepted by someone who should not have accepted it. The dispatcher who accepted the doctor's report about the body in the stairwell. The deputy who accepted that Ruby was not a patient and therefore did not require a full search. The VA police chief who accepted that Tim was a resident and therefore not his department's problem. The hospital staff who accepted that Logan had eloped. The mother who was told her daughter had been discharged. The partner who was given pending treatment updates for a man the hospital had already lost. In every one of these cases, the first answer was wrong. In every one of these cases, somebody who asked a second time, or filed a records request, or pulled the surveillance footage, or read the autopsy report, eventually established what had actually happened. The truth was, in every case, recoverable. The truth was, in every case, much later than it should have been. The interval between the institution's first answer and the actual truth is the interval in which the patient died, or in which the family searched for a year while the body was in a drawer, or in which a man with no shoes walked into a lake that the search radius did not initially include. Close that interval. Ask the second question. Ask it on the day, in the hour. Ask it of the staff who were on shift, of the supervisor, of the supervisor's supervisor. Ask it in writing. Ask it loud enough for the surrounding patients and their families to hear. The institution is built to accommodate the first answer being accepted. The institution is not built to accommodate the second question being asked publicly, immediately, and with documentation. That is the leverage point. That is the only consistent point at which the failure pattern breaks. These are the cases. These are the institutions. These are the families. The work, in your hospital, in your city, with your family, begins or has already begun. Document what you see. Compare it to what the chart says. Ask the second question. Watch what answer comes back. The next patient is, at this moment, in a room with a wristband. The wristband, in every case examined here, was still on the body when the body was finally found.